So the Founding Fathers were disruptive leaders. Let me mention or a couple of them. George Washington, everybody's heard of him. Now everybody's heard of him because he was the first president of the United States, and he was the leader of the Revolutionary War military effort. He won the war, and he was first president. I should say by this side, he was a great leader for a number of reasons, but when he died, he wasn't all that popular, frankly, for some political reasons. It took a long time before there was a monument built to him, but interesting, when he died in 1799, he said, "Don't bury me for 2 days." Now, why would he say that? Was that an example of great leadership? Well, in those days, the doctors were so bad, they tended to bury people alive. So coffins had bells in them, and you would ring the bell if you woke up alive. That's where the phrase "dead ringer" came from. He also, in his will, was the only founding father who said, "I want to free my slaves." The only founding father. 1/3 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were slave owners, and about 1/3 of the people who signed the Constitutional Convention at the Constitutional Convention were slave owners. But only one of them freed his slaves upon his death. It was George Washington. But he said, "My slaves are freed upon the death of my wife, Martha." So if you're Martha Washington, you're sitting there, you're saying, "Now wait a second." So actually she freed the slaves. But okay, so what was so great about George Washington? Was it great that he was a great military leader? He was a terrible military leader. Generally, he lost almost every battle. He did win the war, but wasn't a great military leader. As president, he was pretty good, but he was a little dissatisfied, and he wasn't considered maybe as disruptive a president as maybe he thought he was going to be. But his greatness was something I would call humility. And he did the two things that really set him apart and really set the tone for our country and really changed the way leaders are looked at. When he won the Revolutionary War, he did something that nobody had done before, really. Attila the Hun, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Oliver Cromwell, Napoleon, they didn't win a war and say, "Okay, I'm going back to my day job." They stayed in power, and they ruled. George Washington said, "I'm going back to my farm. I'm going back to my plantation. I'm done. I did what I'm going to do." And King George said, if that's true, he's given up power that way, he's the greatest man on the face of the earth. And that's what George Washington did. And when he was president of the United States, he didn't really want to serve a second term. He did serve it at the behest of many of his friends and so forth. But at the end, he decided he didn't want to have a royalty. He didn't want to stay forever. He didn't want to turn it over to one of his friends or somebody that was related to him. He said, "I'm leaving. You pick my successor." And that was kind of a tradition that stayed with the country for quite some time. The president serves 2 terms, even though it later became part of the Constitution. It was a tradition he set, and we really kind of got out of the business of having a royalty kind of situation because of George Washington. So he led by humility, and that was really one of the great things that was disruptive about the way he led. Most military leaders stayed in power. He did not. Another disruptive leader was James Madison. He really, I'd say, was disrupted by persistence. He was a person who recognized the Articles of Confederation weren't working very well, so he plotted to kind of build the Constitutional Convention. He got it done. He was there every day. He took notes. He worked very hard to get all the compromises. He got George Washington to show up at the Constitutional Convention, which wasn't easy. And then when the Constitution Convention reached its agreement on the Constitution, he led the effort through the Federalist Papers to get it confirmed. And then, when he recognized there was no Bill of Rights, and that was one of the problems with the ratification, he drafted the Bill of Rights when he was a member of Congress. So persistence, that's what he did. And really, we have the Constitution we have today, probably more so because of James Madison's leadership and persistence behind the scenes. He didn't want headlines. He didn't really want to be out in front. He did it behind the scenes. It was a really interesting way of being a disruptive leader. And a third disruptive leader was Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was a person who had an incredible number of jobs. He was our ambassador in France. He was the creator of the University of Virginia, governor of Virginia, first Secretary of State. He was third Vice President of the United States, third President of the United States, second Vice President, first Secretary of State. Had a lot of terrific jobs. On his tombstone, though, he said he just wanted one thing, or 3 things, but the first thing was that he was the author of the Declaration of Independence. And he was a disruptive leader by his writing skills. He had writing skills that were really quite well recognized at the time. When he was at the Second Continental Congress, he was asked to draft up something called a Declaration of Independence to kind of explain why we were going to break away from England. He did so. He had 17 days to do it. He took more or less the last 4, as everybody waits to the last minute to do something. And then he wrote a document that is probably one of the most famous documents in history, the Declaration of Independence, because it was a very unique concept. We're going to explain to the public and to the world why we're breaking away. There was no legal reason to do that. There was no legal obligation to do that. But he said, I'm going to do that. And he did it in a way that was very articulate. And he read 3 parts of this Declaration of Independence. The first part was the preamble, ignored by virtually everybody. The second part was said, here's all the sins of King George. And the third part was, here's what we're going to do about it. Interestingly, the Continental Congress changed a lot of it, in his view, mutilated it, but they spent no time on the preamble, essentially. And the preamble contained a sentence in it that became the most famous sentence in the English language. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, buried in that sentence is a concept that it was difficult to see how Jefferson wrote it. He was a slave owner. He had 60 slaves. He had 2 slaves with him. But he said all men are created equal. Now, how could he say that? Because all men weren't created equal, and certainly all people weren't created equal. Really, what he was really saying, in effect, at the time is all white Christian men, reasonably well educated, are created equal, more or less. But interestingly, people took this concept and ultimately ran with it. And they basically took his words, and they used his words later on to mean that this is what America is all about. All men are created equal. Really means all people are created equal. All people have equal protections. All people have equal rights. All people have equal freedoms. Now, of course, we fought many wars and did many things to get those rights and freedoms and protections, and we're still fighting for them. But it was that concept that Jefferson wrote in his Declaration of Independence that took hold, and when, of course, Lincoln gave the great Gettysburg Address, that was the concept he used. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth in this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, of course, we fought a civil war over whether all men are created equal, and we've done many things to make it more than just men and more than white Christian property men. But that concept took hold, and that was a disruptive leadership. And actually, when you think about America, what America is really about, and what America did to the world and disrupted the world, was it created a society where people could believe that they had a chance to rise to the top. They had a chance to be treated equal. And that's why so many people, including my forebears, came here, and many of your forebears came here because they thought this was a society that really had disrupted the world. And it disrupted the world by enabling people to think that they could rise up and they could achieve what their talents let them do. And for that reason, Jefferson really was quite a disruptive leader. Maybe unintentionally. He didn't realize at the time that he was writing that it was such an important statement. But he did, through his own words, disrupt really society, because the way those words were interpreted really disrupted the world. So you take those 3 leaders, Washington through his humility, Madison through his persistence, and Jefferson through his eloquence, and you have 3 founding fathers who really did things that today would be very difficult to do. I've thought, what would happen today if we put people together in a room and asked them to come up with the equivalent of the Declaration of Independence or the equivalent of the Constitution? Would we be able to get 57 people in the case of the Declaration of the Continental Congress, or 55 in the case of the Constitutional Convention, to come up with something as good as the Declaration of Independence or as good as the Constitution? I don't know the answer to that. My fear is that today Twitter and emails and other things would disrupt the thinking and the dialogue. You never know. Maybe we'd come up with better ideas. But when you think about disruption, think about the people who were disrupting society back in several hundred years ago. What Washington and Jefferson and Madison, and of course Benjamin Franklin and John Jay and John Adams did to really change the course of not only American history but world history, was quite disruptive, and something I think we all are indebted to them for, even though they didn't have the term disruption then.